Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia with Councilmember Allan Domb. Councilman, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Larry. Appreciate being here.
So the first thing I'd like to ask you about is the big story from last year, the big problem. Last year, the city set a record for homicides. How do we make sure that this isn't happening in 2022? And what kind of other quality of life issues should we be focusing on?
Well, first, let me just say that cities across the country have the same problem that we're having in Philadelphia. But that doesn't mean we can't deal with it and make it a lot better than it is today. And it is the number one issue by far for Philadelphia is public safety and people feeling that the quality of life is there for them to stay in the city, thrive in the city, not be afraid to go out of their homes. I've heard that from people. We need to bring back that feeling of good public safety. So we have to be committed to solving this current violence epidemic. And there's nothing more important than focusing on this. It's more important than anything else. And when we saw last year, I think the levels of violence last year were one of the highest we've ever seen. I think in 2021, we had about 562 shootings. Unfortunately, that was up dramatically from prior years, dramatically. You know, in 2022 so far, we already have 17 homicides in the first 10 days, which is up 31%. But that's just based on that percentage. But you have to also remember when you go behind the shootings, every one of the victims is a human being, is a family member, has mothers and fathers, has husbands and wives and children and family members and friends and colleagues and classmates. They're human beings, and you can never forget that because these are tragedies that we cannot bring back. It's very sad. And we have to show all Philadelphia, every community, where these bullets are flying around our neighborhoods, that we are getting this under control. We need to. There's nothing more important. And we need to do it as a team. We can't do this fragmented. And I'm going to say this to everyone. We can't do this in a political way. This has to be done in working out the solutions in a collaborative way with everyone working together, and put the politics aside for the benefit and safety of the residents of this city. We know in the past what we've been doing hasn't been working well. So we kind of need to think a little out of the box and a little differently. Some of those tools, and I'm going to mention a few, then I'm going to tell you what I think the biggest tool is at the end, is of course, working together as a team. And I believe this is already starting to happen. And I'm happy that it is happening. And I think we'll see some positive results from this teamwork. We introduced in council a resolution calling upon the administration to bring together the greatest minds in our city of the world-class colleges and universities to work with us and to provide advice, capture data, and guide us in the review of this ongoing research, and also the investment that we put forward as a city council of $155 million for this violence epidemic. So there's also tools that law enforcement needs. And we saw a few years ago, not every police officer, for example, didn't have a cell phone. I mean, we need to make sure that law enforcement has every tool possible to stop the violence, get it under control, and be able to utilize this technology to fight the epidemic. Tech surveillance. I'm sure there's ways of using tech surveillance that we could utilize and social media surveillance that would help us in creating a better environment. And last but not least, and probably the most important, and I don't know if people are aware of this, but the city of Philadelphia launched a pandemic modified version of group violence intervention known as GVI strategy in August of 2020. And the goal was to reduce shootings by 30% by the end of 23. The GVI strategy was developed by Professor David Kennedy, who we've spoken to, brilliant guy. It's worked in other areas. It's worked in New York. It's working now in Chester. And GVI aims to reduce a specific type of gun violence that involves members of neighborhood groups. And there are basically, in Larry, in simple terms, we know who are the people who are most likely to be doing the shooting, and we know most likely who the people are going to be shot. And in the big picture, GVI focuses on those groups to give them help, not to put them in prison, but to give them help, get them on the right track. That's what we need to do. And we are on that process. And in fact, yesterday I signed on to a letter from my colleague, Councilmember Kenyatta Johnson, asking former police commissioner, who's now the chair of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. That's former police commissioner Charles Ramsey, one of our best police commissioners we've seen in the city of Philadelphia. We're asking him to increase the monies for this program so we can have more of the group violence intervention. And it's been successful. It's one of the most successful programs that's being utilized in cities across the country. You may have seen in Delaware County it's working. You may have seen in Chester it's working. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to copy what's working the best and utilize it in our city. And this group violence intervention is one of those really, really good tools. So I am hopeful. I do think we're going to get this under control. We just need to have everybody on that same path, working as a team, because this is more important than anything else. There's nothing more important, Larry, than people feeling safe living in the city of Philadelphia. It doesn't matter what the taxes are. It doesn't matter anything else if you don't feel safe. We need to make sure we provide that public safety.
That's right. And I was very interested in the legislation you put forward that you just mentioned about bringing experts together, almost kind of like a think tank. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you envision that working and maybe when that could possibly begin?
So we put forth the resolution for the administration and the mayor to call upon our universities. We have tremendous academic universities in this city that are really, really some of the best in the country, if not the world. And they have done a lot of research in this area. What we want them to do is basically analyze what we've been doing, tell us what's working, tell us what's not working, and let's reinvest in those programs that are working. I don't want to wake up a year or two from now and say, hey, we just wasted $100 million on programs that did not work. We want to do that almost on a monthly basis so we know how to invest those monies into the programs that'll save lives. This is all about saving lives.
So one of the things that we've been following closely here is the contributing factor of the difficult economic situation that can factor into the violence we've been seeing. In terms of how we exit the pandemic, we already had these problems before the pandemic, but how we exit the pandemic and create a more equitable Philadelphia. What kind of things do you think could be useful in doing that? And what is, if you even know, like what would a timeline be for something like that?
I think if you're referring to like, how do we provide more economic opportunity and jobs in the city? When you look at a lot of our information and you look at how we compare to other cities, because, I always hear the reports that, well, we're doing better than we did 20 years ago, but we weren't doing that great then. So that incremental increase doesn't really mean much to me. What I look at is how are other cities doing compared to us? And one of the glaring statistics, Larry, that is really upsetting to me is that from 2009 to 2018, of the jobs the city of Philadelphia produced, 60.5% paid less than $35,000. The national average was 29%. Cities like Philadelphia was 28%. We were 60.5. Now think about that. We're producing the majority of our jobs that are pretty much at the poverty level, which means the jobs we're producing are not the good paying, high paying jobs for our residents in order for them to have a sustainable lifestyle. And a lot of that comes from our tax structure. Because when you look at our tax structure, what we have done is the more productive jobs have been really developed and relocated out to the suburbs. You take a drive, and I don't do this very often because I'm all Philadelphia, but if you go out to King of Prussia or these other areas, they're booming out there. And a lot of those jobs were in Philadelphia. We need those jobs here. And you have to understand there's something called an economic job multiplier. For every good job you create in the city that, let's just say, pays 60, 70, 80, or 90, or $100,000, you create 2, 3, or 4 more jobs. And one of the highest economic job multipliers is in the area of life sciences and technology, which in my opinion will be our future. So we have to make sure that we develop jobs in those fields and keep them in the city of Philadelphia. Right now, we're very good at developing cell therapy jobs in Philadelphia, but many of those companies are relocating to other areas such as Boston and Washington, D.C. We need to keep them here. We need them to stay here because it's not just those jobs, it's all the other jobs that spin off from those companies. And so to answer your question, Larry, you're going to say, well, how do you do that, right?
Right.
And so some of those issues are, we need to, when we have a tax commission and we're working on it, and I will say that we need to look at our wage taxes, which are onerous. We'll have to look at the business taxes. Let's face it, we have very high business taxes. And when we did the chart, my office did the chart of the top 50 cities in the country. New York City has the highest business taxes of any city in the country. They're at 17.2%. Philadelphia is number 2. And by the way, I don't want to be number 2 here. I want to be number 90, okay? We're number 2 at 16.2. So 16.2% taxed on businesses. You know, number 3 is California. And their rate, Larry, 8.8. We're 16.2. Chicago's 7. Boston's at 5. Atlanta's at 4. Why would you expand your business in Philadelphia or bring your business here when you're paying double, triple the taxes in these business taxes? It's just, you're going to go to the suburbs. You're not going to stay in the city. So the issue is not just the wage taxes. It's also what we call the net income tax of the BIRT tax, business income receipts tax, which is 6.2%, which is driving those companies that we want in the city out to the suburbs. We did another survey, Larry, not to get too much into the weeds, but of the cities across the country, most cities' employment compared to the suburban employment, they were about equal, same numbers, 24% suburbs, 24% city, some varied by 1 point. Atlanta was the only city where there was dramatically more employment in the city versus the suburbs. And Philadelphia was the only city that had 25% less employment in the city than the suburbs. And that should tell us that, with all these statistics, maybe we need to fix these tax issues in order to have growth in the city. We have a tremendous opportunity in Philadelphia. Think about it. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that University of Penn Medicine, without them, there'd be no vaccine today. They developed one of those formulas that created the ability to have the vaccine. All of us should be so proud of that. That is amazing that Philadelphia, through the University of Penn, is the reason why in the world we have a vaccine today. I mean, that is just, to me, the greatest thing I could ever think. I'm speechless because I'm so proud of what they've done. And we have more things that have come down the pike like that. We've cured pediatric cancer through cell therapy. We are on the cutting edge of medicine in Philadelphia. We're number 1 in the world for cell therapy solutions in medicine. It's number 1 in the world. That is the future of medicine. So we have a lot of great things here. We just want to make sure that those companies that get started here, that we have the infrastructure to make sure they stay here. That's really the key.
When we talk about reducing the wage tax, and that's the one I'm thinking of more specifically, but also the business tax, are you concerned that we wouldn't be able to recoup that revenue? Because we are a little hamstrung when it comes to the uniformity clause at the state level. We can't alter property tax rates. So where does that extra revenue come from?
So I will say this, if you go back to 2016 and you look at our budget's grown about $1.3 billion. Let me repeat that, $1.3 billion from about 4 to 5.3 billion. If we had done these adjustments back in 2016, we wouldn't have to worry about anything because that additional revenue in the budget, mostly coming out of real estate increases and valuations, would have covered the taxes that we lost. That would have been solved. So I think going forward, we need to look at several areas, but I do think that by doing these adjustments, we'll see growth in more jobs, which means more wage taxes. We'll naturally, there's no secret that the real estate values seem to have increased over the past year or two. It's nationwide. We're seeing inflation. So we will see a growth in our valuations, which means more real estate taxes for the city. So I think there's an opportunity here without a tax increase to create that environment where we're lowering wage taxes, not dramatically, but setting the right message, but also making us more competitive for the businesses that are here to expand and to attract maybe new businesses to come here.
And you bring up a very important point that over the last 5 years, the city budget's gone up by about $200 million every year. from about 4 billion in the last Nutter administration to what I think it was 5.2 last year, 5.2
It'll be
billion.
probably 5.3 to 5.4 this year, right?
Yeah, yeah, like clockwork, it seems like. So yeah, that's a valid point. So speaking of budgets, this is we're entering one of my favorite times of year here, budget season. Is there anything specifically that you're going to be keeping an eye on, or that you think people should know about as we enter this budget season?
Well, I think my office and my goal has always been that how do we create more good paying jobs in the city? And that's been our focus. How do we create a fair economy? You know, we passed a wage tax bill, which was one of the most, in my opinion, progressive pieces of legislation that has been passed in the past few years. It basically, we did the research, Larry, it showed that sadly, Philadelphia taxes lower income people the highest of the top 50 cities. We tax them at 18.1%. And other cities, whether it's New York, Chicago, Phoenix, or LA, tax them between 10 and 14%. And then we wonder why they're in poverty. These are mostly families earning less than $32,000. We are taxing them the highest of any municipality in the country. So we passed the wage tax bill that basically reimburses those people who are making on the lower end of the wages, the wage taxes that they're paying the city. Not the full amount, but the city portion of the wage tax. And that could be $800, $900, $1,000, in some cases, $1,200 a year, which I hope people that are listening, if they qualify, they'll apply for that refund. That's money that goes back to them that can help them pay bills, put food on the table. But that type of legislation we need to do more of. We need to help people that basically can't survive in this economy. Now, we're seeing more inflation right now. That's going to hurt, not going to hurt the people at the upper end of the income. It's going to hurt the people at the lower end of the income. So we have to provide more of those supports. So something I'd like to see this year, Larry, I'd like to see more and more people apply for the wage tax refund. And of course, the child tax credit and the ITC.
I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you for joining us today, Councilmember Domb. I really appreciate it. To kind of piggyback on what you were saying about the tax credits and stuff, as you know, the child tax credit that was part of the American Recovery Plan is about to expire. Has the city thought of a way that has the city thought about maybe doing its own form of a tax credit for people with kids?
So, one of our goals was the wage tax program that we put forward, which is the reimbursement of wage taxes. And we'll have to look at that going forward to see if that can be increased and to provide that benefit. But look, the reality is the city doesn't have a ton of money right now, but we do want to try to help those that need the help the most. And so I would say that wage tax program, maybe we can expand it, and we probably need to look at the child tax credit.
Now, you are, when you're not being a council person, you are a realtor. You deal with housing. And the subject of affordable housing has come up due to the fire in Fairmount last week. And, the fact that folks, if you have a great job, that's great. But if you can't afford a place to live, that's a problem. Is there anything that, as somebody who is in that line of work, and is there anything that we as a city could be doing to kind of, make that a better situation? And is anything has come up as part of talks in the budget that you all, like preliminary discussions regarding the budget?
Well, we have a program to help first-time home buyers where I think we're giving between $8,000 and $10,000 to help first-time lower-income home buyers. So that'll help. But I also think that a lot of this has to do with getting people good-paying jobs. Because one of the things about Philadelphia is when you look across the country, we are probably at the bottom of average income of major cities. I think we're in the low 40s. And we're also just came out that we are number 1 or 2, I think, in most affordable cities, most affordable for housing. So the issues aren't necessarily the housing costs as much as they are the types of jobs we have in the city. So we need to do both. We need to improve the quality of the good paying family sustaining jobs, but we also need to look at the housing options and see what we can do to support people. I think it's clear to me that, like, for example, on this eviction program, it is better to help people, support them with some sort of payment to pay their rent than to go through this eviction process. That to me was a very successful program. And in the end of the day, it's smarter for the city to keep people in their homes, roofs over their heads, than to have them not have a roof over their head. So whatever we can do to support that, that would be helpful. I'm not asking landlords to pay for it. It's probably something that the federal, state, and city has to support. But in general, I'm in support of keeping people in their homes and having the federal, of course, the federal would be first, state would be second, the city would be last in the way of funding it.
Now, you mentioned GVI, the group violence initiative pilot program earlier in this interview. And there, as part of last year's budget, there was a $155 million peace budget that focused exclusively on gun violence and getting rid of it. Have you all talked about whether or not that's something you're going to propose a renewal of to the mayor? And if so, will that include more money for GVI in addition to what you might get from the from the folks at the Commission on Crime and Delinquency?
Well, I think that's the purpose of the resolution we put in place, and that is to determine what's working and what isn't working. So for example, if we find some programs that aren't being productive and we find others that are, we should reallocate the money. I mean, 155 million is a good amount of money, and we want to make sure that, you know, maybe we need $25 million in group violence. I don't know that answer yet, but that's why we need outside people to analyze this and determine what's producing the best results.
Okay. Now, I don't know if Larry wanted to ask this question, but because, you know, we've had folks come from council and the mayor's term of office ends in 2023. So we're asking people who we've heard might be interested in running for the office if they've thought about it. And you are one of those people. So have you thought about running for mayor? And if so, where are you in that process?
I would say that I'm seriously considering that option. And that is the language that was given to me by the Board of Ethics. That would be the proper statement for me to say. And I would say this, look, I only want the best for the city. And that's my goal. Whatever's best for the city, that's what I'm in favor of. And I've also learned, I will say this, Denise, in politics, one of the most important lessons I've learned is to do as much work as possible and allow other people to get the credit. And that is very, very important in politics. And so I really don't have a strong ego. I'd rather get the work done. And at the end of the day, that makes for a better city.
Okay, thank you. Larry, did you have any other questions?
So I have one last thing that I'd like to do here. Councilman, you passed a significant piece of legislation last session regarding streeteries and eateries in the city. Is there anything you're looking at for the spring? Any kind of legislation, any kind of initiatives that you think are going to be really important in this session?
So let me mention, Larry, on that legislation, the legislation we proposed, and I have to give a lot of credit to my chief of staff, Erin Santamore, who was really created that whole environment, created the hospitality group, did all the work, really. She did an amazing job with my staff, with Laurel and other people on my staff. And we're looking now, you know, the original legislation was citywide, where everyone would play by the same rules. We thought that was fair and ethical. The legislation did get adjusted in the committee, which I'm not on, to state basically that about 65 to 70% of the outdoor streeteries could basically apply to the city, but the other 30 to 35% would have to go through their district council offices. We are hopeful that maybe we can amend the legislation and maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 additional district council people might want to come on board. And we think over time, maybe we can get to a point where there's more and more people that'll have it as one way of basically getting your streetery done versus 2 different systems. I understand the issue, why they wanted it that way, but I think that the best way is the original proposal we had.
All right. Councilmember Allan Domb, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Denise.
Okay, let me stop.